Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. The American invasion and occupation of Iraq means different things to different people. Some call it a fiasco and one of the biggest blunders since the creation of the American Republic. Supporters of the American enterprise in Iraq disagree. They claim that time will heal the current wounds and transform Iraq and the Middle East into an oasis of prosperity, peace, and democracy. The critics look at the massive death toll and charge that President Bush and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair are personally responsible for the tragedy that is Iraq today. They wonder what future political gains can justify what they see as a colossal catastrophe. Imran Khan reports.
Another dark night and an ambulance races through Baghdad with its gruesome cargo. This time it's victims of a suicide bombing. The hospital's ill-equipped to deal with the dead. It's just another cost of the Iraq occupation. But who has the moral right to determine whether this cost is worth the result? And the cost is also mounting in terms of lives, money and infrastructure. So far, the Iraq adventure has cost, according to some figures, 1 million Iraqi lives, over 4,000 US lives and $1 trillion. But there are some who say the cost is worth it. Iraq will emerge through operations like this one in Mosul against al-Qaeda fighters as a democratic, free oasis in the Middle East. Others are not so convinced, saying even if that happens, the cost is too much. There are others who go further. Iraq may have been under a dictator, but it was not a threat to anyone else. We did not ask you to come here. Why pick on Iraq? Even your reason for war, weapons of mass destruction, proved to be untrue. All you have left is death and destruction. Those are just some of the opinions expressed by ordinary Iraqis every day. Despite all of this, George W. Bush, the US president, remains convinced of the importance of his overtures towards the Middle East, where he arrived on Wednesday to celebrate the creation of Israel. He outlined his plans in a speech to the Israeli Knesset just a day after.
From Cairo to Riyadh to Baghdad and Beirut, people will live in free and independent societies where desire for peace is reinforced by ties of diplomacy and tourism and trade.
But that vision is a long way off, and what will it cost?
When you look at the devastation in Iraq, the continued instability, the loss of more than 4,000 American lives, the many thousands wounded, the hundreds of billions of dollars expended, the distraction from other American priorities, including the economy, the war against al-Qaeda, Arab-Israeli peacemaking, the consequences for the region. Therefore, the war hasn't been worth it.
Whether the cost of the war is too high or not, it's Iraqis that are bearing the brunt. Even as you watch this report, the violence still continues, people are still dying. But who decides whether the cost is worth it, and who has the moral authority? Imran Khan for Inside Iraq.
To examine the profit and loss sheet of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, I'm delighted to welcome from Washington Patrick Clausen, Deputy Director for Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and George Joffe from the Center for International Studies at Cambridge University, and from Cairo, political activist Ashraf al-Bayoumi. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Patrick Clausen, let me start with you. This profit and loss sheet of the American invasion and occupation, people look at it and they see it's drenched in bloody red and not solid black. Surely they are right, or are you saying they are colorblind?
If a person is dying of cancer, it may be necessary to have an operation to cut out the cancer. The day after the operation, the patient may say, "Doctor, what did you do? I'm in much worse shape than I was beforehand." But it's only by cutting out the cancer that the patient can eventually get well. The pain comes first, the advantage comes later. And that is what we are seeing in Iraq today. First came the pain, and the advantage is likely to be coming only now, only in the future.
Ashraf Bayoumi, Patrick Clausen asking for more time for healing. The operation has been done, it's carried out successfully. You guys have just to wait and take more of it.
First of all, the analogy is false from beginning to end. How can we evaluate the pluses and minuses of an invasion of Iraq? First of all, the objectives of the invasion itself, which is the fragmentation and domination of the Arab world, and the suffering that the Iraqis have received. I mean, this business of cutting the cancer, there was no need to kill thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and to force people to leave their country and to pollute the country with depleted uranium and so on. This analogy itself is a fascist analogy. It justifies the killing and the murder of hundreds of thousands of the people. It is like if Eichmann and Nazism have succeeded in Germany, they would say, well, the pain and the suffering justifies the ends and so on. This is the most ridiculous analogy.
Let me engage George here.
Of
George,
the pluses and minuses has to take into account the suffering of the Iraqi people, the suffering of the American people themselves as well.
George, let me engage you here. More time is needed. Will more time heal the wounds or actually deepen the pain? As we have seen for the last 5 years, it's getting worse and worse.
Well, I have to say that I find Patrick's analogy a very interesting but totally inaccurate one. The fact is it's objectionable on 3 grounds. First of all, nobody in the States actually agrees with him. John Alterman of CISIS, a similar think tank in Washington, only yesterday described the whole of the Bush administration's policies to be a disaster and a failure, and that would include Iraq. And then secondly, states aren't people, and what's good enough for people in terms of surgery may not apply to states in any way at all. And then thirdly, the argument overlooks the fact that the principle of intervention in other states is one that is not accepted by the international community, and that on almost every occasion has proved to be wrong unless sanctioned by the United Nations. Now, in those terms, quite frankly, to suggest that more time is needed after 5 years, a greater length of time than the First World War, to achieve the outcomes desired, in view of the enormous losses, seems to me to be frivolous.
Patrick Clausen, in summary, where you are saying we need more time in order to see the forest from the trees. We are too close to the events. You just heard 2 rebuttals. Go ahead.
Well, as Mr. Jaffe said, nobody agrees with me in America, except the democratically elected government of the United States of America. Nobody agrees with me in Iraq, except the democratically elected government of Iraq. I'm sure that it's annoying to intellectuals to have to face that problem. I'm sure it's unpopular. I'm sure it's very unpopular with the intellectuals that the democratically elected results don't agree with them. I'm sure you don't like the fact that people got to vote.
Iraq is democratically elected.
In the millions, people got to vote. People voted. Sir, people voted.
Ridiculous.
You may not like that.
Ridiculous.
I know that's not what happens in Egypt where you are today.
You should read the CIA reports from Vietnam about the false election in Vietnam.
Shouting is wonderful. Shouting is wonderful.
Hold on just a second. Let me hear Ashraf. Go ahead, Ashraf.
Shouting is wonderful, but democratically elected governments are unusual in the Arab world.
To say that the government of Iraq is democratically elected is a false statement, to say the least. You should read about the election in Vietnam, and you should read the declassified memos of the CIA to the headquarters speaking about they have to falsify the elections in favor of Van Thieu. What democratically elected under occupation? Democratically elected governments under occupation is an oxymoron.
George, the ace in the hole the administration normally touts, and that is the biggest plus for the American enterprise is toppling a tyrant. Saddam is no more. Iraq is a democracy. There are elections, there are parliament, and vibrant newspapers and media. Does that by itself carry a big weight in the Western world?
Well, of course it would do if it were true. But the evidence is that the democracy is purely formalistic, that in fact the question of the freedom of the press depends heavily on the major parties in power, and that the question of genuine freedoms is virtually non-existent. There is, after all, an insurgency going on. And let's just take the case of the provincial elections to come. Now there, the United States has supported the current Iraqi government in trying to eliminate one of the parties to those provincial elections to make sure that the party it favours should win them. And yet the United States administration in Iraq admits that if the Sadrists were allowed to stand unhindered, they would win at least 60% of the vote and the seats throughout the whole of the south of Iraq. Now that doesn't seem to me to argue for it being a genuinely democratic process at all.
Patrick, closing the two gentlemen, they have left you nothing.
Well, look, after 5 years after the war in Korea, that was the general consensus about Korea, what a dramatic failure it was. 5 years after the war with Germany and Japan, that was the consensus. It was terrible. There was no prospect of democracy. There was no return of order. Germany was divided. How horrible it was going to be, both in Germany and Japan, and for that matter, Korea. And yet today, these are vibrant democracies and prosperous countries.
Because the analogy is somehow flawed. Germany and Japan, they declared war on the United States. You remember Pearl Harbor, and you remember the Germans attacking the U.S. Marine ships.
My dear sir, there are always differences in every historical circumstance. The question we are asking is whether or not it is too early to judge, and whether or not the pain after a war is one that will last for a number of years and the gain will only be seen later.
The legality of the declaration of the war has not been mentioned at all.
Oh yes, I've noticed that. I've also noticed a series of historical inaccuracies. The picture that Patrick portrays really doesn't correspond to the history of the last 100 years at all. The reality is that in many cases, after the First World War, for example, and after the Second World War, first of all, developments took place in very different circumstances. After the Second World War, for example, there was indeed a Cold War taking place. But apart from that, in Germany, within 5 years, a government had been established. It was led by Dr. Adenauer, and it already had begun to cooperate in ways that demonstrated its willingness to join the international system. So I don't really think those parallels apply. And the most important aspect is the one, as you say, of legality. There is a justification for intervention in other states if the international community should agree. But if it doesn't, then it means that the intervention itself is bound to be seen not only as illegitimate, but as partial.
George Joffe, thank you for that comment. We'll continue our discussion after a very short break. Stay with us.
In the end, it has come down to a careful weighing of things. We can't know with precision the costs of action versus the costs of inaction. Paul Wolfowitz, former US Deputy Secretary of Defense.